All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Progressive Black Talk Media here on air online at wordradio.com. I'm Charles Ellison. Welcome to Friday morning, and you know what time it is. It's time for EcoWord Magazine, our exclusive insights at the intersection of environmental and climate justice and other issues as well, especially particularly dealing with race, racism, and income. I'm the managing editor for our EcoWord project here at WURD. Also normally host, executive producer, creator of Reality Check, your daily dose of public affairs, Monday through Wednesday. Then I'm also anchor for City Council Live, which you did hear live exclusively on WURD, but we are in EcoWord Magazine. We have a very special conversation, very special panel, Microsummit, that has been produced for you today here on EcoWord Magazine. You won't hear it anywhere else. We are going to talk about unaffordable housing. We've put together an esteemed panel of an illustrious panel of experts for you to start this conversation. It will be an ongoing conversation because we're all dealing with the pinch of this unaffordable housing crisis. And we're going to talk more specifically about what can states do. Typically, when we talk about unaffordable housing, we think about what cities are doing. We think about this as a city problem. However, there's a lot of activity that's already taking place in state capitals. You know, we talk about that quite a bit on Reality Check. We talk about the importance of state capitals, what state legislators, state policymakers are doing. And they're doing quite a bit, and they're pondering on quite a bit about what's the next step in housing. But first, we do need to get a grasp of this problem. And I have several people here with me, including policymakers and thinkers here today to help navigate us through this. So let's go ahead and introduce them if we will. I do see him. New York State Senator Kevin Parker is joining us now. How are you doing, Senator Parker, representing parts of Brooklyn and New York? He is also chair of the Council on Communities of Color at the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, our partner, our co-producer for this conversation today. And Senator Parker has been gracious enough to lead on this. More information on the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, by the way, of which Pennsylvania is a state member. Go to csg-erc.org. So definitely thank you, Senator Parker, for joining us this morning. Also joining him is a legislative colleague in a CSG East member state, and that's Pennsylvania State Senator Nikhil Saval. Many of you in the Philadelphia area know him. You may be a constituent of his. And he's also in the Pennsylvania State Senate, recently passed the Whole Home Repairs Act. I'm sure we're going to talk about that a little bit over this hour. So thank you for joining as well, Senator Saval. Also, Sabrina Bazil also joins us from New York. She is the director of the Black Housing Project, which is based within the Center for New York City Neighborhoods. More on Sabrina, by the way, at sabrinafbazil.com. You can get more information on her and the work that she's up to. And Lauren Belor. Lauren Belor is Associate Director of State and Local Policy at the Racial Economic Justice Organization, think tank based in Washington, D.C., known as Prosperity Now. Go to prosperitynow.org for more information there. Okay, so let's go ahead and start the conversation. I'm going to start with you, Chairman Parker. What's your definition? Let's go around the table and get working definitions. Everyone's working definitions of affordable housing, because there's a lot of controversy and a lot of confusion there. Senator Parker?
Well, I think that's actually the crux of the problem, right? There is no kind of, one definition about affordable. When you talk about affordable, the question is affordable for who? In the district that I represent, which is a very large homeowner district, right?
Mm-hmm.
What most people, when they talk about affordable, they're really talking about low income. Right. But I represent a working class district. The dynamic in my community is I have teachers married to social workers who have no place to live, nurses married to transit workers who have no place to live. And so my definition in my community is really based around workforce housing as opposed to low income housing. And so I think when we talk about affordability, that the issue is about affordable for who.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. What do you think, Senator Saval? Affordable for who? You run into some of those same issues in your district?
Absolutely. I mean, I think Senator Parker is exactly right. I mean, the problem is immediately there in the question. I mean, the fact that we even have a definition of affordable housing shows what's wrong with our housing market. which is that no one should be struggling to find and secure housing. No one should be struggling to stay in housing. No one should be housing insecure. Housing is a human right. And so really we should be striving for a situation in which we don't really essentially don't create distinctions between affordable housing and other kinds of housing, that everyone who needs housing, which is everyone, has the right to be able to secure it and can do so without undue burden on themselves. So really affordable housing is a kind of jargon, of affordable housing development. And so, I think many of us as policymakers, advocates, lawmakers, I hope we are trying to find and create a situation in which, everyone has an ability to be housed. And we're of course quite far from that. And the reason, and one of, the fact that we have this kind of narrow definition of affordable housing is part of the problem.
So, Rena, what say you, especially with your experience working with the Black Housing Project, I'm sure working in neighborhoods or trying to assess and come up with solutions for neighborhoods like Senator Parker's district, and that affordable housing definition, how confusing, how contentious does it get?
Yeah, for me, my perspective is coming from a place similarly as Senator Saval is, housing as a right. Everybody should be housed. So I'm coming from a space of affordable housing is housing that everybody can afford at all incomes. If you have, no income, you are houseless, you are low or moderate income, everyone should be able to afford and be housed. And we haven't seen the affordable housing that people need for, low to no income because of the narrow definition of area median income as defined by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. But largely, if I'm coming from a framework of housing as a right, then it's housing that everybody should be able to afford, kind of releasing ourselves from that jargon, as Senator Saval said.
Yeah, thank you for that. Lauren, how complex does it get, right? And I needed to start this discussion about that definition of affordable housing. I hear this quite a bit. We all hear this quite a bit, especially when I'm broadcasting here daily on WURD. We regularly get into conversations about housing. There is this, Philadelphia was always viewed as one of those, especially out of the big cities, one of those last oases of actually truly affordable housing. That you have a lot of low income homeowners, using that as an example. That's increasingly becoming less and less the case. But how can, especially from your vantage point in Washington, D.C., looking at also how the federal government treats it, but that definition, how important is that?
It's very important because it creates a narrative, quite frankly. And, I'm always thinking about the why. We have to think about who and what coined those terms, affordable housing, and also thinking about who even coined the term cost of living. That shouldn't even be a phrase because there should be no cost to live and breathe in this country. So that being said, it's important to look at the current shifting homebuyer landscape with the rising cost of living across cities in general, whether major cities, gentrified cities, your average Midwestern suburb. Mortgages or simply home loans are almost a necessity to be able to even be a contender for purchasing a home. And so those that are disproportionately impacted with those demographics through socioeconomic class or race are not even contenders at the table. And so I think looking at the different factors pipeline wise of what contributes to affordable housing helps to define that definition. And it's a lot of intersectionality there.
We're having a discussion, a Microsummit here on WURD magazine this morning, entitled Unaffordable Housing and How Do States Step In, how do states step up, how do communities, how do we all step up with this growing crisis? It's an emergency. Indeed, we're here on WURD magazine doing this in conjunction with the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, more specifically its Council on Communities of Color. I'm Charles Ellison here. I am host, creator, managing editor for WURD magazine. We also have, this is a hybrid session, a live broadcast here on WURD. Go to wordradio.com. Any of you listening in at wordradio.com, feel free to also leave questions at #EcoWord, #equitable governance. But we have folks who are attending this as a webinar. You are free to now leave questions We will try to answer those questions throughout this hour in the Zoom chat here in the webinar feature of this live broadcast. So I welcome attendees in this webinar to leave questions or even maybe a comment that we can add to this conversation over the next hour here. And also you can email me during the broadcast, cellison@WURD Radio. I'll look out for questions at cellison@WURDradio.com as well. So Senator, like, what do we do about this housing crisis? How do we make sure that all these millions of housing insecure and also homeless people are getting housing? What are some solutions you're looking at, Senator Parker?
I was wondering which senator you were talking about. Multiple of us. And Nikia, let me just say congratulations and nice to meet you. I actually used to work at the state legislature in Pennsylvania.
That's right.
And live right downtown Harrisburg at Boaz Street. But until Vince Hughes, I said hello. He's a good friend. I actually worked for him when I worked there, but before he actually went to the Senate. You know, I think there's a lot the state legislatures to do. In fact, I think that we are the sharp end of the sword as it relates to this housing issue and housing crisis. I think I begin in a place that I think I hear Lauren talking about as well, which is the issue of home ownership. And I think that we have to also broaden our definition of home ownership, of not just thinking about kind of the one family home with a white picket fence, but look at co-op and condo models as well, and figuring out how do we expand the notion of equity within the context of housing, and making sure that all classes and races of people get access to those home ownership opportunities. But obviously, you know, subsidies of any kind that we can provide, and I don't think that we've done it in a great way in most places. We certainly have not done a great job at it in New York. But let me go back for a second and just make 2 points about ownership. The first thing I actually should have led with is that we're still in the middle of a foreclosure crisis in our communities, and so there's Black equity being lost all the time as it relates to housing, right? And so we need to do a much better job, and particularly in Black communities. And I'm not saying it doesn't affect other communities, but being in my community is predominantly an African American community. And you know, but Latino communities I know as well are having a huge problem with the foreclosure crisis. And so we need to look all over the country at stemming the tide and seeing what we could do to help people get out. Initially, if you go back, and y'all look a little young on this Zoom, so back in 2007 when we had the housing bubble burst, right? I know y'all read about that. I'm giving y'all a hard time. I'm an old man. I'm just trying to get used to it. But in 2007, we had the housing bubble crash. That was about mortgages, right? And then now the foreclosure crisis oftentimes now is not just about mortgages, and actually less about mortgages and more about things like taxes, and people can't afford their utility costs. And again, as chair of the Energy and Telecom Committee, I know I'm dealing with that. The state of New York has almost $4 billion in utility arrears from the pandemic. And there's really no plan either statewide or nationally to address those arrears. And so that becomes a part of this conversation. So there's people who have home ownership in this moment, and people who may be even in rental situations who can't afford their utilities, right? And so that becomes part of it, of getting people to be able to stay in place. Senior citizens who are house rich and cash poor and want to age in place are having a problem, right? And so you know, we may want to even just begin by just looking at how do we allow people just to kind of be where they are first, and then start talking about home ownership models, but I think creates more stability and obviously helps people with equity as they grow. They grow, you know, as they kind of grow in their situations. And so states have a lot of ability to kind of address both of those issues just to begin with.
You know, real quick, before I go to Senator Saval, Sabrina, I'm real curious to get your thoughts on this, about what you think that legislature, you know, such as, you know, like the New York State legislature and other legislatures should be doing in a moment like this. And I do want to get to that question. I do want to unpack more area median income ensuring that people 0 to 50% of area median income wherever you live are being addressed here. But go ahead, Sabrina, your thoughts on that, what that solution or that legislative solution should be.
Yeah, first, I just want to kind of just quickly set context. There's about, just like based on similar analysis done by City Limits, about 78,657 people who are unhoused and housing insecure, about 52% people who are rent burdened, and 28% who are severely rent burdened in New York City. And so I think in thinking about that, as well as thinking about our goals with traditional market rate housing or homeownership, I think we need to be clear about, especially in my work with the Black Homeownership Project, is are we trying to get individual rich people rich off their housing by using it as an investment and speculative asset, or are we trying to permanently house everyone long-term affordably? And we know that the first option hasn't been working. Because of the intentionally racist housing practices and policies of our unequal homeownership and housing system, where white households have been able to amass massive wealth at the expense of Black and Hispanic households who've been intentionally excluded from the housing market and stripped and undermined of their wealth by predatory actors, subprime mortgage crisis, et cetera. So I bring all of that into the conversation because is the answer to correct this injustice by then getting more Black and Hispanic households into the traditional market-based homeownership, or is the answer to fundamentally change the rules of the housing market game and to make it more just? And so when I'm thinking about solutions, I'm thinking about not just tweaking on the edges of the market-based system to make it incrementally better for a select few individuals who we've now expanded access to, but my answer lies in structural adjustments to our racist housing policy and the way that we're planning for housing and having a framework that's a right to housing, which means aggressively going after predatory actors who are intentionally targeting Black communities, whether, looking at property tax reform that's especially tilted against Black and brown communities, looking at acquiring, expropriating distressed properties, over leveraged properties from bad actor landlords, vacant properties. Like, we need to be aggressive in our approach because we're dealing with structural systemic issues that's causing displacement.
Yeah, been going for a long time. Senator Saval, yeah, your thoughts on that too, because it's and Sabrina making some real good, both Senator Parker and Sabrina making some good points here, but your thoughts on that too, as far and how we achieve getting those who are 0 to 50% who are below AMI housed. It's and Sabrina made a real good point there, something I've been kind of grappling with and thinking about for quite some time now, about like what is our goal here with housing? Like, are we trying to make them perpetual investment tools, like retirement tools, once you get a house, if you're lucky enough to get a house, or are we just trying to get people housed? So go ahead, Senator Saval.
Yeah, it's a great question and an important, in some ways the problem in a system that is, overwhelmingly market based. And so, how much, what are we doing to make housing, fundamentally permanently affordable for everyone? I think that's that is the overwhelming goal. I tend to think about this in, I came into office at the kind of height of the pandemic. I was sworn in January 2021, and that in some ways shaped a lot of my approaches to, at least personally, in my approaches to housing. And so I tended to think about things in terms of critical interventions and then long-term structural solutions. Not that those two things are obviously, totally separate. In fact, one often points to the other. But during the pandemic, we developed a lot of innovative policy tools that were emergency solutions, such as the rental assistance program. Here in Philadelphia, there was a pioneering effort to combine rental assistance with eviction diversion. so that no one who was facing an eviction would be evicted without having exhausted every attempt at applying for rental assistance. And this cut evictions by 75% in one of the fourth highest evicting city in the country, basically pointing to a model in which you could end poverty-based eviction. And it became adopted in some form in cities and counties across Pennsylvania, across the country. It was led by now former council member Helen Gim. So that, that's an instance where I think, you actually have a policy solution that, but fundamentally is designed to help people in an emergency, but could have long-term structural effects to keep people housed. But then we have just major issues, as Sabrina was pointing to, that are systemic, pervasive, systemically racist, that date from, for decades in the housing market, that from the collusion of the federal government and the real estate industry, fundamentally to exclude working class, overwhelmingly Black working class residents from, having housing stability. And we need a number of different tools to tackle that. One is to eliminate, there are various ways that we, it's fundamentally, there are very few restrictions across the country on rents. We need to be having more conversations about how to control rents in this country, and so that people are not needlessly losing their homes because of a completely capricious spike in rents from their landlords. Good cause eviction. I know that has been a long-term goal of the New York State legislature, or very powerful goal of the New York State legislature. We need to be preserving our existing housing stock, and maybe we have had some success with that here in Pennsylvania, with legislation that I was able to get adopted. There are ways that, frankly, you can't, if you are a returning citizen or returning resident, you have barriers to housing because a criminal record can prevent you from getting housing.
Yeah.
And then, frankly, we have an overwhelming supply crisis. Preserving existing housing is part of tackling that, but we're just not building enough affordable housing for middle and low and working class people.
Let me actually stop you there, or cut you off there, Senator, because to bring in, because you actually make a good point right then. At that point, I want Lauren to jump in, because Lauren, you had just recently released this inclusionary zoning study, or the study you're pitching this concept of inclusionary zoning to address just what Senator Saval was saying, or identifying, that housing supply issue, preserving existing stock, enhancing that. But, do we need to build more stock? But when we build more stock, make sure, once again, we're getting people who are, making 0 to 50% of AMI in that housing. So talk about that, and also some other thoughts on tools you think need to be played out here.
Yes, so there's a couple of things and factors here. One being inclusionary zoning or zoning reform. And before diving deep into that, for the sake of the audience, zoning allows local governments to regulate which areas under their jurisdiction may have real estate or land use for particular purposes. So some zoning classifications include residential, commercial, agricultural, industrial, or hotel hospitality, among other specific designations. So zoning laws can be changed by local government, and this is where policymakers are so important and vital to drive this conversation around inclusionary zoning, or as also known as inclusionary housing. These policies that mandate or encourage new residential developments to dedicate a share of homes to lower moderate income families are inclusionary housing strategies. And the most common method is inclusionary zoning, which creates specific affordability targets, but again, that's in quotation marks, affordability, and local land use codes that help to create incentivization programs. That being said, though, inclusionary zoning is not a one size fits all. Like, yes, you can, as observed, as mentioned in DC, not only living here, but also looking at the work, IZ programs, were used to ensure accurate medium income targeting. So it does help to address AMI and setting long affordability periods. But, as Senator Parker mentioned about the previous mortgage crisis, which we're still facing today, and also aligning that with foreclosure, and also aligning that with what Senator Saval mentioned about preemption and rent stabilization. Other things that are needed to address this would be looking at CDFIs or community development financial institutions that help communities address these gaps, because giving communities opportunities to have a voice or say in the development around their environments is really, really key. Also, what's really key to expanding and sustaining home ownership are to reduce land costs to homeowners and insulate them for real estate speculation. So cooperative ownership, which Prosperity Now, the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund, and Capital Impact Partners made equity investments to create Rock USA, whose mission is to make resident ownership available to manufactured homeowners nationwide. So this model involves providing loans, training, and technical assistance to resident organizations. So like cooperatives, land trusts also help preserve affordability and assets. And in 2019, the National Community Reinvestment Coalition published a report detailing the extent of gentrification displacement from 2000 through 2013 in American cities. So the emergence of CLTs or community land trusts is another response as well. So again, all of these things, I know that was a mouthful, but all of those things combined are essential when addressing housing affordability.
Yeah, and also real quick too, for those who are attending the webinar portion of this live Microsummit broadcast here on WURD during our usual weekly broadcast of EcoWord magazine, if you're an attendee in this webinar, feel free to leave a question or a comment in the Zoom group chat. So I'm not going to bring you on camera or audio, but I will relay those questions. I will ask those questions out loud if you have some. I know there's some people that are watching in, attendees in the webinar. Please leave it in the Zoom group chat. If you're in the audience, the larger, broader WURD listening audience, email me a question if you have one, something you'd like to ask these panelists while we have them for a half hour more. C. Ellison at wordradio.com. Also tag me on Twitter at Ellison Report on Twitter. We'll be watching, so please continue to do just that. Senator Parker, I mean, how do we get to a point where we can align the housing market with people's actual incomes? Because because it's clearly people's incomes are not keeping up, and it's been like this for a while with the way the housing market is acting. And one of the features of the housing market that's very troubling is how we're having an increasing amount of, because now we're not just talking about homeowners, but we're also talking about tenants, because half the population rents, right? We're having an increasing amount of corporations, corporate landlords who are buying up residential property, like 25% of, like in Philadelphia, for example, 25% or more of residential property is being bought up by corporate landlords, and they're setting the prices, and it's just pricing everyone out. So how do we, what do we need to do, and also, and while at the same time preventing discrimination against Black, Brown, and other marginalized populations?
Charles, you're asking for a lot. Okay.
I know,
So
I'm trying to fit in as much as I can within this next half hour. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, well, the first thing is that I think that doing what we're doing now, right, which is, expanding the conversation about it and organizing ourselves and getting people who are like-minded and see housing as a fundamental right to work together and organize. And I think in the context of kind of state and city action, part of what we need to do is set regulations that don't allow these corporations just to set rates at whatever they want to do, whatever price they kind of want to be at. And certainly, like, we've had ideas about, like, it can't be, like the AMI piece is there, but I think we need to kind of rethink that and figure out how we do something that's more micro targeted, right? Because it's actually a regional, the way we do it in New York is a regional approach that doesn't work at all. And so, I think that's the beginning of kind of addressing that. And again, as you heard the senator say, we just need to build. We're not building enough. And in New York, that's a harder proposition because we're landlocked, because we're an archipelago. And so, and the question is how tall do you want to get in places like Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx? And so those are some of the challenges, but that's, I think organizing our conversations about it and kind of putting our heads together about various approaches. I don't think it's going to be a approach. I think it's going to be several approaches we're going to need to implement simultaneously to get there.
We also have this, Sabrina, I'll let you take this question from well, first there's a statement here from Tim Scott. I don't think this is the Senator Tim
Tim Scott.
Scott. Yeah, right. But there is somebody named Tim Scott who's one of the attendees on the webinar, just making a statement. Structural adjustments to our housing policies would require all levels of government working together. I believe this approach should be led at the municipal level and either state or federally supported. So that's maybe it is Tim Scott, Senator Tim Scott, I don't know. So also Dr. G.S. Potter, who's actually a regular contributor here on Reality Check, is listening in on this and asked these two questions. Sabrina, I'll let you chime in. How do we increase housing supply without promoting gentrification? What protections do renters, especially BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, other people of color renters need? And that'll lead to some other questions. But Sabrina, go ahead. I'll let you respond to that.
Yeah, so my position is that the discrimination and the structural issues of the housing market is tied to the housing market itself. And so for us to build without discrimination or without displacement, we need to untangle ourselves from the racist, classist, discriminatory private market and work towards building a decommodified structure and system, fully funding public housing, and in doing so in a reparative housing justice framework, so we're not recreating systems of hierarchy and exclusion. And also because the point of public housing and community control of land and decommodified housing is that it's housing supply that's obviously targeted, it's affordable, but it's away from the speculative market. And it's intentionally designed to not be predatory and not cause displacement, designed to encourage social equity and increase governance and engagement and civic engagement. So yeah, there's a way to increase supply, but for me, we really just need to think about who's building it, who's owning, and if we want to, have a full government approach, having municipal, local, state, federal come to the table in a serious manner to actually fully fund these programs.
Yeah, no support. Yeah, first of all, your response to that, and also looking at state solutions again, especially when you're in a state like Pennsylvania, where the minimum wage is still like below poverty level minimum wage. Still what? Still $7.25. I'm like, how can you afford housing with that? You can barely afford like one of those storage units. $170.25 an hour, right? So it's also kind of like, are there state solutions there as far as wage parity or increasing the wage? Like hopefully maybe there'll be some work or some progress on that front, but also increasing, being able to build more housing, but doing so in such a way that does not displace people. Go, oh, you're on mute, Senator.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh.
You think I'd be better at this point?
That's all right.
Yeah, it's definitely a critical question. I mean, so one, of course, our housing crisis is inextricable from so many others. You've mentioned the crisis of stagnant wages. I mean, it's by so many different measures, people were earning more several decades ago in terms of what their wages were, what real wages than they are right now, in any state, let alone Pennsylvania, where the minimum wage has been stuck at $7.25 for, over a decade at this point. So increasing the ability of people to organize and form unions, to bargain collectively at every level, I think is one of the ways that we start to raise the wage floor, in addition to kind of blanket policies that raise them by fiat. But in terms of, you know, what is a fairly long running debate at this point in terms of the you know, the kind of supply issue versus displacement, gentrification. You know, this is a problem. I mean, I think many people would hold, and I mean, certainly I would, that a supply problem is simply that, a supply problem. We do actually need to be building more housing more generally. And we, you know, not just so in Philadelphia, for example, you want to accommodate people moving to the city. You want to accommodate growth in some way, and not doing it ahead of time means that you will face a constriction at some point. But building new market rate housing can send a market signal, basically, that raises rents in an existing area and has the risk of displacing people. So we really need protections like a form of rent stabilization or control, protections against, you know, we have very few protections against eviction in Philadelphia and this state, ways that make sure that people are able to stay in their homes, even when we probably do want to be building more in transit corridors and the like. I do share Sabrina's view that we need more public forms of development. Obviously, we have public housing. We know the story of the massive disinvestment in public housing that has taken place over decades. But there are projects in states like Maryland, in Rhode Island, and in the city of DC, as I understand it, quite recently, to create public developers, to actually find ways of buying and building on municipal land. This has precedence in a number of different cities, in Singapore, in Vienna. I mean, and it's not, bringing up those examples may seem like, well, this is a different context for us, but the United States wanted to pursue that very model in the 1930s. When we ended up with the Public Housing Act, before that, there were all these modes of, we'll build cooperative housing, we'll fund nonprofit development. Now, of course, there's much more conversation about community land trusts, as Lauren was discussing, many different forms of ownership. I think there are ways to increase overall public or, you know, kind of cooperative forms of ownership, in addition to ensuring that we are overall, you know, increasing the overall supply. And I think all of those things, you know, will contribute to an overall supply, that the overall growth in supply, while ensuring that we have permanently forms of affordable housing, so that we're not displacing people when we're building more densely in, you know, in transit corridors and the like.
Yeah, we're actually going to take a quick break. I'm going to take a quick commercial break here during our discussion on affordable housing. How do states step in? How do we all step up? I'm Charles Ellison here on WURD magazine. Lauren, we'll come back to you after that break. I want to get your thoughts on another question that's popped up, and we're here on WURD.
Hello, WURD listeners. This is Iola
Stand by,
Harper
everyone.
of the
We'll be
Enterprise
wrapping up
Center,
after this.
Philadelphia's premier center
Great.
for
Sounds
minority
good.
business growth. This holiday
I think we
season,
lost
we're
Senator
hosting
Parker.
an all-Black pop-up
You'll
market
come back.
at 26 South 52nd Street, featuring over 30 local Black-owned businesses. You've got to come out and shop. We have so many great gifts like candles, jewelry, books, dolls, cards, accessories, hair care, and more. Our pop-up is
Came back.
open Tuesday through Sunday through the end
Thanks,
of
Senator.
January. Visit us at www.theenterprisecenter.com.
Hey, senators, you know, Senator Parker, Senator Savall,
Remember, folks, this holiday season,
this would be a
don't
great
forget to
conversation
buy
in
Black.
Toronto when CSG East
JD's Auto Body and Painting,
next
Philly's
year
premier painted
in
body shop,
Toronto,
provides
because you
everything
know
you
it's
need
Canada
for
and they
expert
dealing
auto
with
body
it.
repairs.
Like all their
Car
housing
accidents
is
are
like
an
totally
unexpected
unaffordable.
occurrence.
Like,
It's stressful,
so
interrupts your
I
life,
just
and
we'll
causes
talk offline.
unexpected
We'd love
expenses.
to
So let JD's
think about
professional
what that
staff
looks
and
like,
expert
and that
technicians
might be
relieve
something
your
that
stress and get your
Lauren,
car back
Sabrina,
to pre-accident condition.
y'all could
Fast.
be
Get your free
coming up to.
estimates with 10% savings
It's gonna be a
today.
major
Call
meeting in Toronto.
215-848-5949.
next year in August.
JD's Auto Body and Painting, Wayne Avenue in Washington Lane in
What's that
Philadelphia.
now?
Gets the job
said
done
Toronto
right
isn't
the
far
first
from my
time.
home
Expert
state of
workmanship,
Michigan.
frame service,
Oh, it's not
top of
far.
the line
Okay, so that
painting,
works.
Yeah,
free
so
towing,
I'm
claims assistance,
frequent in Toronto.
deductible help,
That's
and
cool.
all
All right,
work
good,
is
good. Yeah, I love
guaranteed.
Toronto.
Find
I would
out
love
what it
to.
feels
Toronto,
like to be a
Toronto's one of my
valued
favorite
customer.
cities.
Call
I go to Caravana every now and then to Toronto.
215-949. Philly's
Yeah,
leader in auto body and painting. JD's Auto.
we went to
Visit
Caravana before
JD'sAutoBodyandPainting.com.
pandemic.
Hey, this is Doug
Unfortunately,
Henderson,
the
and I
annual
trust
meeting's
my
not
car
taking place
repairs
during
to
Caravana,
JD's
so
Auto
like,
Body and Painting.
I'm always on point.
but
From
that's
my
okay.
hair to my style to my yard. But let's be real. I can't be at my best if my health is slacking. More people have been
I could do
hospitalized
Eastern
from
Parkway,
Omicron than any other variant.
Senator.
So I got an updated COVID vaccine.
in
It
the
protects against the original
subsequent
COVID virus
the following
and
couple of
Omicron.
weeks. Yeah,
I stay
annual
up to
meetings
date
are
so I can
August
stay
20th through the
on point for the
23rd
ones I
next year.
love.
So everyone
Find
just kind of
updated
have
COVID
that on your
vaccines for
calendar.
everyone 5 plus
But
at
this, I want to have a
vaccines.gov.
housing
Paid
discussion
for by the U.S. Department of
at
Health and Human
annual meeting
Services.
next year.
Our 6th annual empowerment experience is coming on
We can
Saturday,
unpack it
December
more.
10th, and we have an opportunity for vendors like you. Do you sell items that would make for perfect gifts? Do you make or resell clothing, jewelry,
Oh, that's
dolls,
right.
candles, sweet treats,
Oh,
or
thanks
baked
for that.
goods? Do you sell paintings
August
or
20,
sculptures?
23rd through
Do
the
you want
23rd,
your business to
2023. Yeah, you
connect
can't,
with
that's
Word
not,
listener? Then
that's
become
very
a
easy to
vendor in
remember.
our
I just
holiday
realized that.
marketplace during our 6th
All right.
annual empowerment experience. Saturday, December 10th from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. To find
by.
out about pricing and additional information, please email sales@wordradio.com.
You're listening to Word Radio, 96.1 FM and 900 AM WURD, independent Black media.
All right, welcome back to Eco Word Magazine. We're here on Progressive Black Talk Media, on air online at wordradio.com. Also live in Philadelphia. Philadelphia Radio has us on 96.1 FM, 900 AM. But throughout the nation, throughout the world, many do listen in. Many of you are listening in right now at wordradio.com. Also watching us on Word TV, tuning in on your Word app from anywhere in the world. I've tried that. I've listened to my Word app from different places around the world on a few occasions. It does work. So do download your Word app today. Lauren, yeah, your thoughts, as well as we're getting close to wrapping up this discussion. We need more time, but I'm going to do the best I can, squeeze out as much out of all four of you in this hour. But I'm thinking about other things too, in terms of regulating, heavily regulating, and how do states and municipalities do this? Regulating corporate landlords, regulating landlords. I don't see enough of that happening, and looking at ways in which we also eliminate things like deposits and credit reports to get housing. Are those things that are being looked at? Are those things that, and I'm going to get back to you, Senators Parker and Saval, on that question too. Are those things that are being looked at? Or are those things that could be moved on?
So this has definitely been a conversation because BIPOC or Black, Brown, Indigenous communities are disproportionately impacted by debt collection as well.
Right.
And as we have the conversation, about medical debt, student loan debt, even when we talk about the criminal justice aspect or intersection of this relative to housing vouchers, so to speak, as Senator Saval brought up, these are all things that play a role. And so all of those things need to start being addressed. And I know the Biden administration made an announcement earlier this year to address the medical debt aspect of this. And I know Chief Chopra, through conversation with many partners, including myself, has discussed looking more into how banking institutions are playing a role. Bank of America decided to address some long-stemming history of predatory lending that comes from banking institutions relative to home ownership. So those are all things that play a role, essentially. But we also need to think about more innovative solutions to home ownership. And this was kind of brought up a little bit about different types of housing, in addition to co-op ownership, maybe thinking differently. And this is where the accountability piece comes in for policymakers. What types of development? You could also, there are some organizations and developers thinking more about tiny homes or shipping containers, homes or manufactured homes, because home living and how someone chooses to live also looks very different today. So we want to make sure that's addressed, because HOA fees or homeownership association fees are also discriminatory practices. And many people can't afford to not only get the home, but maintain the home once they have it. So all of these factors are keys to the pipeline of housing affordability.
Yeah, it also, before I go on, I did get an email from Jasmine Banks, listener Jasmine Banks, who's asking, can you discuss how America's housing crisis impacts low-income families raising children with disabilities? My culture, unjustly in parentheses, loses culture because of dual discrimination. Poor, can't afford utilities and stable housing, not child abuse, but American racism, exploitation, and abandonment of vulnerable at-risk families. Sabrina, if you want to jump in on that, respond to what Jasmine is saying there. And I'm sure that that's something that that's a conversation you have daily with the Black Housing Project.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the way in which we've been seeing from speculation, that there's a through line, especially with predatory actors coming in, harassment. We're seeing deed theft, of course, scams, but just this housing system itself, and the way that we see continuing discrimination for voucher holders, for people with disabilities, people with for source of income discrimination, people with children. This is a systemic issue, despite the number of testing that we've done, despite despite the fair housing laws on the books. So I think, again, for me, it comes back to, do we want to keep continuing to work and maintain and existing in this broken system, market-based system, that continues to produce discriminatory outcomes, or do we want to separate ourselves from it, untangle ourselves from it, and remove ourselves from the speculative market, create alternative models, public housing, community land trusts, cooperatives, again, that increase governance and ownership, or stewardship, control of people's own self-determination, destiny, autonomy. That is how we can fight back against encroaching, predatory, speculative actors and behaviors that's ongoing.
Yeah, Senator Saval, yeah, some thoughts. I noticed you want to jump in already. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I just one way that we certainly in Pennsylvania that this form of discrimination against families with children takes place is just the high presence of levels of lead in our homes across the Commonwealth. We have tons and tons of homes that have unremediated lead. There's not a lot of pressure on, and not just homes, but of course apartments. There's not a lot of pressure on landlords to make changes to ensure that these homes are habitable, which, having unremediated lead means that especially for families with children, they are uninhabitable. They have real risk to those children. And these kinds of environmental hazards extend throughout homes. I mean, frankly, inadequate plumbing or heating, basic critical repair issues for people with disabilities, whether people with changing physical needs who are elderly, or younger people at all ages who have disabilities. It becomes harder and harder to inhabit a fundamentally aging housing stock in Pennsylvania. Yeah. So we can make major interventions into this. I mean, this was one of the reasons that I helped, or that I introduced and would help to secure the Whole Home Repairs Act here in Pennsylvania. It is meant to help with critical interventions for leaky roofs and plumbing issues, utility burdens, and the like. But it also, it offers grant money and in the form of a forgivable loan to small landlords for lead remediation, for adapting homes for people with disabilities. Also, there are existing programs that it's very bewildering if you're a homeowner or a tenant to access. Yeah. So having technical assistance to be able to access those things, I think there are ways that these are health hazards, right? Housing is also health, and so I think we need to be really making major interventions in that.
Senator Park, I'm gonna let you have the last word here. And before you go on to, we did get a question comment from a listener who I don't have their name, but I appreciate them listening in and asking this, commenting from Plants was actually the name that I'm getting here. But I want to ask what can be done about what I would call home keepership instead of home ownership. Now, when municipalities implement backdoor strategies like raising real estate taxes to the point where you can no longer afford to keep the home that you already own, So thanks so much. Yeah, plants is the only name that I have, but really appreciate that question and listening. We're going to do some more follow-up on that a little bit later on in this program today. But Senator Parker, parting thoughts on now the next step, on where you think I'm sure it's given you some food for thought, right, in this short discussion about what state legislatures can do. Senator Saval taking a big step. It's the first state to do this, that whole Home Repairs Act. Maybe New York can do that, and other states too, since you're overseeing the Council on Communities of Color with CSG East. Go ahead, Senator Parker,
Yeah.
parting thoughts.
Well, certainly one of the things that we really want to do with CSG East is do a best practices and maybe a policy playbook on housing for our communities. That would be a really good step. And it should not just be me and the senator, but obviously Sabrina and Lauren as well should put in ideas of, bill ideas and models that they'd like to see happen, so we can kind of give folks a broad option of things they think may work in their states. Again, I think that this conversation is part of it. And I think that part of it, we have to continue to raise this issue, right? Because again, unfortunately, being in the Senate for 20 years, I know that we legislate by crisis. And so if there's no perceived crisis, it's really difficult to kind of get any movement on issues. And so raising the public discourse on issues is a big part of it. It may seem something like easy, but it is important, and we have to be intentional about kind of making this an important agenda item. As it relates to the question about home keepership, that was a point that I made early on about the foreclosure crisis that's kind of gone silent. And again, I think there's a lot of things that we need to do around there, both intervening with individual homeowners, but also looking at, as Sabrina indicated, predatory actors in the space. And there's everything from deed theft, to redlining still, and all kinds of other practices that we are used to seeing. And so we have to deal with that. And then I think simultaneously look at some of these other models. I really am interested in hearing more about Sabrina's thoughts about how you dismantle the current system and how you transition into a new system that gets us to a place where housing is really a right, and we're trying to house people as opposed to using housing as a wealth building strategy. And I think both can be done at the same time. I think we can walk and chew gum, but I think we have to, again, be intentional about how we do it and make sure that the priority is getting as many people housed as possible. And so, I think, the big piece, and we really need to also have a specific conversation about public housing. So although I hear Sabrina talk about building new public housing models, I think that there's some PTSD around that, given how poorly we handle current public housing, and some of it has to do with most of the public housing actually was built by the federal government and has been, essentially abandoned by them, and so it's left states and municipalities to pour billions of dollars in investment into facilities that they literally do not own. Right. And so we need to figure out some of those processes. And that's been a headache in New York. And just so you understand that just in New York City, there are almost 600,000 people in New York City living in public housing. Right. If public housing was its own city, it'd be the second largest city in the entire state of New York. Yeah. Right. Like that's how many people are living in public housing. And oftentimes in not great conditions. In fact, I grew up in public houses in the Bushwick houses. And so it's been an important part of my housing journey and part of my agenda. And it's one of the things that we kind of have to, again, we can have a whole separate conversation about that. And then what do we do around transitioning some of these federal properties into either municipal or state hands, and with some help from the feds, and doing that from an economic perspective, so that we can have some ownership and have more autonomy about how we deal with these properties.
I saw actually another CSG East state member, the Virgin Islands, when I was in St. Croix last year and was pondering on that public housing issue and question, looking at some of their public housing uh, models and down there. I was actually quite impressed with some of the estates that they have there.
Well,
in, St. Croix.
let me suggest that we take this webinar on the road and we go to St. Croix so that we can visit some of these public housing facilities.
I was actually
really
there
see
were
what's happening there.
Yeah, I was a few and I just happened to be there. I was actually there visiting the mother-in-law's there in St. Croix. So and I was impressed. I realized, and I hadn't really paid attention to it before. I've been there times before, but it didn't even look like, sort of the conventional notions of public housing.
Right.
And it was just hearing some interesting things that they have been doing in terms of the federal funding, U.S. federal government funding that they get, because U.S. Virgin Islands is.
But to be honest with you, Charles, they're not necessarily a great model just because of density and because of size. It's really an apples and oranges comparison, right? Like,
that's a good
when
point.
we talk about what we have to do in New York or Philadelphia, it's exponentially larger, and so it's more difficult to kind of create those kind of models. And in fact, I think from a sociological perspective, you wouldn't even recreate what we did in the 40s and 50s again to put people on top of each other and concentrate poverty in that kind of way. And so I think as we talk about public housing, we need to have a public housing conversation. But again, to Sabrina's point, we need to reimagine how we do it. From a funding perspective, but also from the design and architectural perspectives that we.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Senator Parker, I'm gonna give you the last word. Senator Kevin Parker is a New York State Senator. He is chair of the Council on Communities of Color of the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference. Our partner for this particular discussion here, this Microsummit, we do an equitable governance Microsummit Series with CSG East. Occasionally they pop up here on WURD. We've also been joined by Pennsylvania State Senator Nikhil Saval, author of that groundbreaking Whole Home Repairs Act. So definitely appreciate him. We've talked to him before. Got to talk to him more here on WURD. Represents parts of Philadelphia. Sabrina Bazile is the director of the Black Housing Project at the Center for New York City Neighborhoods. Appreciate them joining us today. And Lauren Belor is director of state and local housing policy at Prosperity Now. Go to prosperitynow.org, of course, for more information there. Thank you all for joining. We really needed more time, but I'll have you again, and there's more discussions to come. So definitely stay tuned, pay attention. Everyone, we're going to take a break, and we're going to come back with more EcoWord Magazine and more of this discussion on housing here on this edition of EcoWord Magazine. We'll be right back.